The Nottingham Goose Fair is one of the longest British fairs in history, being over 700 years old. Local legend tells how there was once a fisherman on the River Trent. After fishing for a while and catching a few carp and other fish, his bait was taken by a monster pike. For some time, man and fish struggled in that conflict enjoyed by anglers. Eventually, the great fish tired and the man began to reel it towards the shore. At that time, as the fish began to emerge from the water, a wild goose flying overhead swooped down and seized the fish in its beak. The goose flew high into the air with its prize, but the pike still had the baited hook in its mouth, and the man still held tight to his rod. Imagine the scene when the goose flew over the market square with pike, rod, and man dangling from its beak. The burden was too much for the bird, and it released its grip. Down tumbled the angler, rod, and fish. The astonished crowd in the square rushed to the man's aid, only to find him standing unhurt in the middle of the square, for he had landed safely on his feet. In celebration of this wonderful event, it was decided to hold a fair on the very spot where the man had landed, and it was to be known as the Goose Fair. This tale purports to be in the origin of Goose Fair, but is of course just a charming folktale. So, what is the true origin of the fair? The clue is in its name and the time of year at which it is held. The fair is truly a Michaelmas fair. Michaelmas, or more correctly, the Feast of St. Michael and All Angels, is celebrated on the 29th of September. It marks the first day of the new farming year and is one of the 4 quarter days: 25th of March, which is Lady Day, 24th of June, which is Midsummer's Day, 29th of September, Michaelmas, and the 25th of December, which is Christmas. These dates are close to an equinox or solstice in the solar calendar and made up the divisions of the agricultural year. Michaelmas also marks the end of the harvest season, and many of the fairs at this time were hiring fairs where labourers, finished with the harvest, would seek employment for the winter. Often folklore stories have embedded in them some sort of coded message or truth. The 29th of September also marks the end of the fishing season and the start of the hunting season. The wild goose might indicate that the man should turn his attention to the hunt. Again, in ancient tradition and folklore, the wild goose in flight has strong associations with hunting dogs, particularly those of the wild hunt. A version of the wild hunt occurs in many cultures, but the feature of the story are always the same. A hero or godlike figure, a psychopomp, the conductor of the dead to the other world, leads a pack of spectral hounds across the sky. Their quarry is the souls of those about to die. In Christmas mythology, St. Michael is recognised as a psychopomp and has connections to the wild goose. Most historians agree that the Goose Fair began just about after the year of 1282. The earliest reference to a fair in Nottingham, St. Matthew's Fair on the 21st of September, comes from Saxon times. A charter to hold a Martinmas Fair on the 11th of November was granted by Henry II to the Priory of Lenton in 1164. This ran for 8 days and was extended to 12 days sometimes in the 13th century. The charter forbade the holding of any other fair or market in district during this time, and so eclipsed all other fairs in Nottingham. Charters were not exclusive to the church, and individual towns were granted the privilege to hold a fair. In 1284, the burgesses of Nottingham were granted a charter by Edward I to hold a fair on the eve of the feast of St. Edmund, 20th of November, and for 12 days following. We can see how, where Lenton Fair was extended, these fairs might have clashed. The word fair comes from the Latin feria, meaning a holy day, defined as a time when a large number of people would assemble for worship. Fairs were held annually on the feast day of a saint, which in turn often marked a special time of year within the calendar. Very quickly, the church realised that fairs were a great opportunity to make money through commerce and trade, and fairs quickly developed into markets, often lasting for several days. So lucrative to their sponsors were these markets, they could only be held under a grant of a royal charter. In medieval Europe, fairs were held in the precincts of great monastic houses and individual churchyards. However, in England, the venue was left to the discretion of the authority, and fairs were often held on village greens and other open spaces. Nottingham's Goose Fair is first recorded by name in the borough records of 1541. Removed from the restrictions and competition of Lenten Fair, the Goose Fair flourished in Tudor times. Although the date for the fair was set as the 21st of September and for 8 days following, reduced to 3 in 1800, and 11-day change to the calendar in 1751 means that it is now held on the first week in October. The first reference to a Goose Fair can be found in Nottingham Borough records of 1541 and in an account by John Truswell, who was the steward at Woollerton Hall at the time. Geese for the Michaelmas market were driven into Nottingham from Lincolnshire. Preparations for the long walk started with tar being applied to the birds' feet. It is recorded that anything up to 20,000 geese were driven through Hockley and along Goose Gate into Market Square. Goose Fair later became famous as a cheese fair, but it is the Michaelmas goose which is remembered and marked in its name. Geese hatched in the spring were ready for the table by Michaelmas, and it became customary for those able to afford it to celebrate with a meal of a well-fattened goose. It was also customary for tenants to present their landlords, in part payment of rent, with a fine brace of geese. Now, each year the fair is opened by a ceremonial ringing of a pair of silver bells, usually by the Lord Mayor of Nottingham. The mayor, the sheriff and aldermen were all asked to formally attend and read out a proclamation for the beginning of the fair, a tradition which began in 1634. The silver bells in question, which are still used today, were created by Tom, the Silver King, Normal, a talent manager for acts such as The Balloon-Headed Baby, Mary Ann Bevan, who was known as the world's ugliest woman, and Leonine, the lion-faced lady. Once the ceremony concluded, the sheriff then reserved the right to have first dibs on whatever he pleased from the stalls. Originally for the trading of goods, fairground rides slowly began to take over, and as transport links to the city began to improve, there became less of a need for an autumnal fair in which townsfolk could stock up on produce from travelling merchants before the winter. But residents still enjoyed a jaunt around the stalls and the eccentricity of it all. By the end of the 19th century, the fair had grown exponentially and now included various gondola rides and gallopers, switchback horses, bikes, yachts, a tunnel railway and animal sideshows. The development of steam power then gave the go-ahead for even bigger attractions to pitch up, so as the helter-skelter, the big wheel and roundabouts and motor cars. The Theatre Royal itself also scheduled special performances to attract fairgoers, and the local railways put on extra services to deal with the crowds. By this point, Goose Fair had garnered a reputation as an excuse for a very good time, something the townspeople weren't all chuffed about. In 1877, members of the Nottingham Town and Social Guild rallied together and held an unofficial inquiry into the moral, social, sanitary and commercial effects of the fair, arguing its 8-day run was far too much for something which had become largely a pleasure festival. The group, made up of individuals with no authority or power, argued that the working class were being most affected, and criticised it as being dirty, noisy and full of pickpockets, beggars and prostitutes. The council's response? Basically to jog on, no matter the state of affairs. It made the city over £702.11 in rent, something they could not pass up on. The fairground has seen some sights over the years, and the modern day goosey seems to be rather tame in comparison to accounts of the fair's history. Possibly the most outlandish of these comes in October 1888 when, as part of the year's attractions, it is rumoured that the aeronaut, pioneer balloonist and US Army Major Professor Thomas Scott Baldwin made the first parachute jump in Nottingham from a balloon hovering over Woollerton Hall to a crowd of thrilled spectators below in the park. 5 years later, Professor England's Royal Exhibition of Performing Fleas pitched up for the first time. Taken from the memoirs of Mr. G.C.A. Austin, Nottingham's Clerk of the Markets from 1907 to 1944, a description of Goose Fair includes a passage about tiny brushes known as ticklers and rubber balls which squealed water, which both became popular accessories to those in the crowds, adding so much excitement to the point where they were banned from becoming such a nuisance. Austin's favourite attractions, however, were the Emmas, rows of grotesque figures which were to be knocked backwards using a wooden ball, and the dancing girls, clowns and jugglers who gave free entertainment to the punters. Goosey was also known to be a host of certain oddities, some freak animals such as a 5-footed sheep and a 2-headed horse, to freak shows, including babies in bottles, armless women, and Polly O'Gracious, the Fat Woman Show. The Goose Fair attractions we know and love today are a far cry from what you'd find just over a century ago. One of the most popular was Wormwell's Menageries, which took over a sizable portion of the market square with over 7,000 birds and animals and 53 employees to keep everything in order. And it's even rumoured that the legendary Madame Tussaud herself arrived to showcase her wax sculptures in both 1819 and 1829. But perhaps one of the most dangerous and bizarre acts was the Globe or Wall of Death, where it wasn't unusual to see a lion be taken into the wall in the sidecar of a motorbike. The other slightly disturbing rumour is that wife selling could have taken place at Goose Fair during the late 18th century, as divorce was only obtainable by private act of Parliament until 1857. Ordinary men could only afford to sell their other half. After parading her around with a halter on her neck, arm or waist, the husband would auction her to the highest bidder. This tradition was a regular occurrence in Wye Hill Fair in Wessex, and there is record of at least one Nottingham man selling both his wife and children in the marketplace in 1779 for the grand sum of 27 and 6. The fair also gained a reputation for its high-quality cheeses, with people travelling far and wide to grab a wheel of what historians liken to Red Leicester. In 1766, Nottingham had just been through a building boom and more people had moved to the city to find work. Unfortunately for them, food prices had also risen sharply due to a poor harvest. On the 18th of October in the evening, a fight broke out between a trader and some Lincolnshire lads who had purchased a large wheel of cheese and were intending to sell it in their home county. And because of the food shortage, folk were anxious that foodstuffs be kept in their local area, so a group of rude lads demanded the cheese to be shared out to the Nottingham populace instead. Violence soon broke out, and so began the infamous Nottingham Cheese Riot. Shop windows were broken, hundreds of wheels of cheese were rolled through the city, and multiple rioters were injured, with one apparent death too. But perhaps the most amusing part of this whole story is the moment the mayor tried to restore peace, only to be knocked down by a giant great wheel of stinky cheese. Goose Fair then moved from the market square to the Forest Recreation Ground in 1928, but people weren't happy about it. So during the 1920s, the City Council had plans to develop the market square area, but had not considered how these things would affect the beloved Goose Fair. On the Sunday evening before the final fair in the marketplace, 12,000 people gathered to protest the proposed move to the Forest Recreation Ground, with speakers including Pat Collins, president of the Showman's Guild. Despite the noise, the council stood its ground and went ahead with the move. Soon after, people's mindset shifted when they realised that the relocation now meant the fair could get even bigger and better. Goosey has made appearances also in very popular arts and culture. For example, the writer D.H. Lawrence, while living in London between 1908 and 1912, would return home each year just to visit the fair, even penning a short story named Goose Fair in 1910. A few decades later, Goose Fair would again be the subject of a written account in history journally by J.B. Priestley, a book chronicling the author's travels around England. Priestley had a slightly more scathing opinion of this much beloved bonanza, describing it as a crushing mass of gaping and sweating humanity, contrived to attract the largest number of pennies in the shortest possible of time. Goose Fair has only been cancelled 4 times in its long history. The first cancellation came in 1646 with the outbreak of the bubonic plague. Celebrations were again postponed during the entirety of World War I, and however, though officially cancelled during the duration of World War II, the fair was held for a week during daylight hours in July 1943 and again in August 1944, as the event was of incredible economic importance to the city. It was also cancelled in 2020 due to the COVID pandemic.